If you travel just west of Rockbreaker's Last Gas, we find a steep hillside overlooking a pre-war mine. At the top of this hillside is an unmarked shack where we found one of the many Keller holotapes. I covered this shack and the unique item inside in my series on the Keller family. One of my favorite things about this point, however, is that it gives us a wonderful panoramic view of the northwestern section of the Capitol Wastes. We see many trees, some completely dead, others seemingly adapted to the radiation. But one tree towers above the rest. If we look to the west-northwest, we see it off in the distance. Pulling out a scope to take a closer look, we realize that it's not a tree at all. Instead, it looks like some sort of radio antenna. This warrants further scrutiny. Heading down the hillside, we can meander on over, where we see that the site is guarded by super mutants. Sharon ran off to do something. I took care of this super mutant right at the base of the antenna. Going around the corner to see what Sharon was up to. Whoa! Good work, Sharon. Glad you're on my side. As we approach, we learn that we have discovered Broadcast Tower KT8. But it's a rather disappointing location. There's not a whole lot here. The tower itself is on a rocky outcrop, and from here we can enjoy a good view of the nearby landscape. We see a few creatures running around, but the final point of interest is a switch on some sort of tank. Upon flipping the switch, we find a brand new signal, radio signal Sierra Romeo. Cracking open our Pip-Boy, we can tune into the frequency where we hear...
I'm sure I heard something.
This, of course, is Morse code, but Morse code is a pre-war communication technique. How many people after the apocalypse can communicate in Morse code? Did we just reactivate a signal that hasn't been heard for over 200 years? But what does it say? The signal reads CQ, 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 DE, SR, 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 K. Perplexing. But not quite so perplexing for anyone familiar with amateur radio. What we just heard are pretty traditional Morse code abbreviations. Since Morse code is a cumbersome communication device, many frequently used words and phrases were abbreviated into 1 or 2 letters, saving a lot of time when using a Morse key. CQ means calling. When not specified, it can refer to anyone. So, calling anyone. They use the letters CQ because CQ kind of sounds like the French word security, which in telecommunications means pay attention. It also sounds a lot like c'est qui, which is French for who's there. English speakers just abbreviated these two French words into the letters CQ to stand in for calling anyone. The next one, DE, means from or this is. This is also a French reference because the English word from in French is de, spelled DE. Next, SR isn't an abbreviation used in Morse code. However, we can deduce that this is likely the operator's call sign from the name of this radio broadcast, which was Sierra Romeo. SR likely stands for Sierra Romeo. The final letter is simply K. In Morse code, this stands for over. The operator says that his message is over and he's waiting for anyone to respond. If he was waiting for a specific person to respond, he would have ended with KN. That is to say, over, now waiting for someone specifically to reply. So we learn from this that the operator wasn't looking for anyone specific, but was waiting for anyone to reply, hoping that he wasn't alone. So putting the whole thing together, the message is, calling anyone, calling anyone, calling anyone. This is Sierra Romeo, Sierra Romeo, Sierra Romeo, over. Well, the signal is kinda grainy. Like many of the pre-war signals we can activate from these relay towers, we have to wander around a bit until the signal becomes more clear. After feeling our way around the area for the source of the signal, we see that it gets stronger as we walk down a pathway between 2 large rocky outcroppings. We notice that the signal gets crystal clear when we stop at the entrance to a sewer. Heading inside, we see that the sewer is completely caved in with rubble. Going all the way to the end, we find two paths. To the right, we see a bunch of garbage and tires, and directly in front of us, more garbage and rubble. So is this it? Where is the signal coming from? While retracing our steps, we see a door to the right that we missed. Heading inside, we find a small little room. There are containers and shelving units on the floor. We find chems, pre-war books, sugar bombs, a variety of scrap. We find a red key card lying on a nearby table labeled encryption key. I wonder what this could be for. There's another pre-war book on a table to the southeast. That's 200 caps already from Scribe Yearling, and a terminal. But the terminal is broken. Bad sectors found in boot block. Terminal error. Thankfully, right next to this one is another terminal. And if we looted the encryption key, we have one option to open the secure hatch. Decry key valid, opening hatch. Suddenly, a stairway appears. We can pull out our weapon just in case, but we see that the staircase doesn't reveal a threat. Instead, it reveals a tiny room with two corpses inside. These are the corpses of Chinese remnant spies? Sure enough, if we activate the ham radio on the table, we turn off radio signal Sierra Romeo. And thankfully, the beeping stops. These are the remains of Chinese spies here on American soil. So before the war, the Chinese communists had infiltrated mainland America. Well, at least Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. On the ground, we find a rare hat, the Chinese Commando Hat. There are very few of these hats in all of Fallout 3. We already discovered one unique one when we did our series on the Pit. That Chinese hat was called the Hat of the People. Both hats have a DR of 1. The Hat of the People from the Pit has +5 to small guns, but this hat has instead +1 to perception. On their bodies, we also find a dirty Chinese jumpsuit. These look amazing, but the stats aren't terribly exciting. When fully repaired, the jumpsuit has a DR of 6 and a bonus to small guns of 5. In this little hole, we also find a mini nuke. Perhaps this explains why both of these men became ghouls, and a copy of Chinese Army Special Ops Training Manual, which permanently increases our sneak. Well, this is a bit of a startling revelation. The existence of this Chinese communist broadcast on American soil gives us the impression that they were trying to contact someone, which means there may be more Chinese here in DC. These two were dead, but they were also ghouls. Could we find some Chinese communists from before the war still living here in DC? That question remains unanswered until we explore the Arlington Cemetery. I explored this place in my video on The Regulators, for it's here where we find and kill Junder's Plunkett. But if, after exploring the cemetery, we follow the road out of the cemetery going south, eventually we come upon some sort of industrial ruin. To the west, we find the Arlington Falls Church metro station. This connects to Falls Church, and incidentally, it's one of the more breathtaking metro ruins in the game, but we'll explore that a little later. And to the southeast, we find two tall factory buildings. One appears to be completely boarded up, but the other, standing intact, surrounded by completely ruined buildings, has two doors. The first door is on the western end. We see a yellow metal staircase leading up to it, and to find the other door, we walk east past the large factory, where we find some sort of tunnel connecting the two sides to the factory. Interestingly, there's a destroyed car standing on top of one of these tunnels. I wonder how that could have possibly gotten there. And we find the second door on the northeastern end of the building. As we approach, we pick up a brand new radio broadcast on our Pip-Boy. The People's Republic of America Radio. We can listen to it while exploring the wreckage and rubble just outside the factory.
Greetings to the oppressed masses from the peace-loving peoples of China. Your boys are dying on the Alaska front, and all for nothing. Bring them home, before it's too late. Do you think your readers will keep you safe if the bombs fall? You will die while the Wall Street gang and their hangers-on live like kings and... The gang of Wall Street fat cats and their Washington warmonger puppets have plunged the world into war to line their own...
War of aggression waged by Wall Street gang? Capitalist masters? Wall Street fat cats? Washington warmonger puppets? This doesn't sound like the pre-war propaganda I'm used to hearing here in America. From where could this broadcast be coming? Perhaps we can find out by heading back over to the main door of this big factory. Here we find a placard by the door, Mama Dolce Food Processor, by appointment only. So this is the remains of a food processing plant. Interesting, but more interesting that it was right inside a cemetery. You'd think that the Food and Health Agency might have a problem with a food processor being on the same grounds as a cemetery. Heading inside, we find ourselves in a large room lit by 2 flickering fluorescent lights. We see 2 paths ahead, a doorway to the south and an opening to the north. The doorway to the south is completely blocked in with rubble, which makes our next path easy. After looting a couple of footlockers and first aid kits, we can head north to round a corner. Here we see tables and machinery laid out, and continuing southwest, we see movement from the catwalks above what appears to be some sort of loading and unloading zone. Our perception and our compass tells us that they are hostile. I didn't know how many were back there, so instead of opening fire, we can activate a turret control system on a table by a fence just before the loading bay. After hacking the terminal, we can either deactivate the turret system or reconfigure its targeting parameters. Doing so causes the turrets to fire upon the enemies.
Over here. We'll get him. Hey.
It looks like there were only 1 or 2. With the threat gone, we can go back to looting. We find a stealth boy on a table next to this terminal, and in the corner, a number of ammunition boxes. Interestingly, these ammo boxes are smaller than the ones we typically find in the game. Just as I was looting them, we get attacked from behind.
There you are. You look like a bad.
And what was that? Was he speaking Chinese? Looting the corpse, we see that we've killed a Chinese remnant sergeant, and he's wearing a dirty Chinese jumpsuit. He also wields a Chinese assault rifle. Mama Dolce's is a great place to go to get Chinese assault rifles to complete the quest Economics of Violence, given to us by Pronto at Paradise Falls. Mama Dolce's is also a great place to go to get sugar bombs. Remember, we need to get sugar bombs for the unmarked quest Murphy's Bombing Run that we got from Murphy at the Northwest Seneca Station. We talked with him in my first video on the family. He gives us 17 caps per box, and we gain the option to buy Ultrajet from him. We likely find so many boxes of sugar bombs here because this was a food processing plant, but wait a minute. What are Chinese remnant soldiers doing at an American food processing plant? Were they here invading America when the bombs dropped and somehow got lost and confused, and then came here to seek shelter and have been here for 200 years, or was this their base of operations? To find out more, we can head through the open door to the west. This leads us to another wing of the factory. On this bottom portion, we find a bunch of boxes to loot, and against the northern wall, we find a garage door to Mama Dolce's loading yard. It's locked with an easy lock. But before going out to the yard just yet, let's continue exploring this factory. Aside from going back, the only way forward is to go up a big metal staircase in the middle of the factory floor. This leads us to a big pod floating above the factory. We see 2 paths forward. We can turn right, looks like the pod goes deeper that way, or we can turn left and go through a door. Near to this door, we see a big shelving unit with more food and sugar bombs, and peering around the corner through the doorway, we see another Chinese officer. On the ground here is a corpse lying in puddles of blood with 2 more boxes of sugar bombs and a big glass of milk. Looks like this guy was on a breakfast cereal run before he was murdered or killed by the apocalypse. Though we don't tend to see a lot of blood around the bodies of people who died to radiation poisoning after the bombs dropped, we usually only see this kind of gore at murder scenes. We'll start by first going east. Let's finish exploring this pod. The eastern path opens up to a very large ruined room. Here we find a table to the northwest with another pre-war book on top and a Nuka-Cola Quantum. Here we find a desk terminal. Mama Dolce's Processed Foods, an all-American business. Plant operations menu. Here we find 5 options. The first, resource levels, Begin. Self-diagnostic reporting log, version 414. Pump number 4, report low gelatin levels. Printer, report low yellow 21B levels. Building temperature, no reading. Check equipment. Flavor inject number 8, report low 21B levels. Great. So they were using the same chemical both for the color yellow in their printer and as a flavoring in some of the food. Gotta love pre-war America in the Fallout universe. In the next one, quarterly analysis, Quarter 1 results show strong growth. Sweet and sour stroganoff, frozen dinner, enjoying unexpected popularity with youth demographic. Quarter 2 projections show diminished returns due to increased cost of domestic shipping. Recommend increased quotient of byproduct use from regional affiliates in lumber milling industries. Seek alternative revenue streams where possible. Okay, well so far it's sounding like a business on the up and up. Probably filled with all of the drama and corruption of typical pre-war American businesses in the Fallout universe. And the next entry, number 3, Human Resources Memo. Please welcome our recent new hires to the Washington, D.C. processing and packing plant. Thanks to new plant manager Robert Whiteman for continuing the speedy staffing of this facility. And the new members are Thomas Jenkins, Michael Smith, Jonathan Apple, and Joe Jones. Thomas Jenkins, Thomas Jefferson? Michael Smith. Smith is pretty common. Jonathan Apple. Johnny Appleseed? Joe Jones? What deranged father would name his son Joe Jones? I mean, these are all stereotypical American names. Almost too American. And the next one, number 4, Urgent Diagnostic Alert. Critical diagnostic message R461B. Radiation levels exceed federal limit. Please contact maintenance. That's strange. We haven't felt any radiation yet. And the final one, number 9, when we try to click on it, error, invalid decry key. Some sort of corruption from time, I suppose. We can loot a suitcase and a safe next to the desk. Strangely, we didn't find an option to unlock the wall safe behind the typewriter in this room, but it's only locked with an easy lock. We can quickly unlock it where we find a stash of caps and a laser pistol. We find even more sugar bombs on the floor here, surrounded by a big knife, puddles of blood, and a human skull, and a second wall safe to the south. This one's locked with an average lock. Inside, we find a silenced 10mm pistol, some caps, and a small stash of chems. Here we can loot the bodies of the Chinese officers we killed earlier, and leaning over the railings is the body of a Chinese remnant captain. This must have been the guy leading the gang here. On his corpse, we not only find another rifle useful for the quest, but also a Chinese officer's sword useful for repairing our Jingwei's electric sword from Operation Anchorage, and Mama Dolce's encryption key. I wonder. Heading back to the terminal, with the decryption key in hand, sure enough, number 5 is now legible. Access encrypted file. Welcome back, Agent Huang. With display settings set to English, we can read, "The Republic People of China salute your braveries. Find established cover operation of Mama Dolce Food Creation Factory. Priority to rendezvous with selected team in covert operations of local area. Job and wage are secured for each within cover operation. Required to inform when first stage of operation is completed. Hail, the People's Republic." So Mama Dolce's was a front, a cover for a covert communist Chinese operation taking place here in DC. These guys were to pretend to operate Mama Dolce's and rendezvous with other spies already here, possibly the very ones we found at that broadcast station. But it looks like the two teams may have never met. The Chinese at broadcast tower KT8 had died. We don't know when, possibly shortly after the apocalypse. We do know that we had to turn on their broadcast. It may have been offline for quite some time. And these Chinese may not have known the extent of the devastation of the apocalypse, or that the war had ever ended. For remember, as we approached Mama Dolce's, we heard their propaganda message still playing 200 years later. Continuing forward, we can go across a catwalk to another pod. Here we find more junk and sugar bombs to loot. Rounding a corner and taking the pod all the way to the end leads to a door, which again leads to Mama Dolce's loading yard. Okay, so that's 2 entries to the loading yard. But before we go to the loading yard, let's finish exploring this place. Retracing our steps, we can pass the serial-loving skeleton on the floor and down that hallway where we killed the Chinese ghoul earlier. Here we see a room to the north with a big hole in it. Some more Chinese attack from the floor below. All that's in this room is a very easy locked first aid box. Now we could of course drop down, but let's take the long way. Heading out and rounding the corner, we find 2 hallways. The leftmost one leads to a staircase leading down, and the right one ends at another door. Let's check out this one first. We see a tipped over Nuka-Cola machine to the left, and at the very end, another door to the Mama Dolce's loading yard. Goodness, how many doors to the loading yard are there? Well, before going in there, let's retrace our steps and go down the staircase to finish exploring this wing of Mama Dolce's. At the bottom, we have 2 paths, to the left or the right. Let's go right. Here we find 2 more skeletons in this hallway, and man, this is an excessively gory scene. Blood splatter all over the place. Every inch of these walls is covered, and it's smeared all over the ground. I'm starting to think that these may be the corpses of the people who used to work at Mama Dolce's. Remember, the previous skeleton was holding 2 boxes of cereal and milk, and these are also holding cooking utensils. This one right here has a skillet and a spatula with a book, possibly a cookbook. My bet, and this is just conjecture, is that Mama Dolce's was a real factory, with real employees making real American food. This would help explain why the first few terminal entries we read seemed legitimate. They were actually about the business going on here at the factory. China then shipped their spies here to America under the guise of new employees to work here at Mama Dolce's. This would help explain the seemingly fake names of the new hires we read in the terminal. Thomas Jenkins, Michael Smith, Jonathan Apple, Joe Jones. It's like they looked up a list of the most popular American names and used them all for these 4 operatives. Then, these operatives killed everyone here before taking it over to run their spy ring. In the adjacent room, we find the ash pile of the Chinese soldier we killed earlier, and another hole in the floor, this one with a skeleton leaning over it, and we see a couple floors below. Hugging the edge of the wall we can scoot over, we find a wall-mounted cot on the other side of the room, and some filing cabinets with some randomized loot. I love this water draining between the floors. That's a nice touch. Instead of dropping down, we'll again take the long way. Retracing our steps, we can go to the end of the hallway and go down the staircase, where we pass by another corpse on the ground. Rounding the corner and down the hallway, we come to another room with a big hole in the floor. This hole leads to some sort of cave. Lying near to the cave is a lantern, a trip hazard sign, another corpse, and a clock. The clock is non-functional, and it looks as if the time on the clock is permanently set to 9:47. This is because the bombs dropped on Washington, D.C. at exactly 9:47 in the morning. But there's nothing else in this room, so heading down, we can crawl into the cave where we find... oh, it's a dead end. We see 2 desks partially blocking the path, and the path ends with 2 safes lit by a torch and 1 skeleton lying next to a copy of Tumblr's Today. This just brings up even more questions. How did this cave form? There's no other way in or out, and yet we hear wind rushing above us. And how were these safes placed here? Was there always this secret room under Mama Dolce's that maybe the old owners used to hide money? And it was only revealed after the nuclear apocalypse, when the floor caved in. Clearly somebody knew about it. This body lying on the ground next to a copy of Tumblr's Today was likely doing exactly what we are, trying to open these safes. We don't find anything terribly exciting inside either of them. It's a rather strange thing to find at the bottom of a food processing plant. But with that, we finish exploring this wing of Mama Dolce's so we can head back up and choose one of the many doors to the Mama Dolce's loading yard that we've found so far. We'll take the last one we passed. Heading up the stairs and rounding the sharp corner to go down the hallway, we can open the door to Mama Dolce's loading yard.
Hey. Sankai! Yeah? You want some of this?
We find ourselves in some sort of elevated pod that was being occupied by a Chinese remnant. Peering out of the pod, we find a bunch of Chinese soldiers wandering around the loading yard. And there's even a sniper in a floating pod across the way.
You like that, you bet?
that about does it. Now that we can turn on our light to better see the scene, we can loot the corpse of this sniper, and we find a copy of Guns and Bullets lying on the ground. This pod connects to another door to the north. Crouching down, turning off our light, and heading through the door, we can go down a ruined hallway and then creep around the corner until...
Where?
2 more down. I tried to find the body of this first one that I killed, but it seemed to disappear. Not sure where it went. Heading down the stairs, we can loot a copy of Dean's Electronics on the very bottom shelf of this shelving unit to the right, and then loot the ash pile of the other ghoul we killed. At the bottom of the stairs, we can round a corner to kill another ghoul.
Found you.
Here we find another skeleton, and again I think this may lend credence to my previous theory. This guy's holding a kitchen knife and a clipboard, surrounded by blood and even bloody handprints on the wall. He was possibly doing inventory before being murdered by the Chinese. This hallway leads to a junction. Turning left, we find a unisex bathroom with a first aid kit inside and a copy of Guns and Bullets by the toilet. Heading back out and going east, we find another door to the loading yard. We'll explore that in a minute, and then a door to the left that we'll go through in a moment, but before we do, let's retrace our steps and go north down the hallway. We can loot the ash pile of the Chinese communist we killed, and then heading through the door, we find one more. We're in a strange sort of room. There's water underneath us. We can hear it sloshing. We see steam rising through the cracks of this metal floor, and we can see it through the holes for the support beams. But there's tables in here, makeshift beds. I wonder what this room could have been for. We don't appear to be getting any radiation poisoning. This seems like a strange place. We do find a large door to the east. Opening it leads to what looks like some sort of generator room. Heading on down, we see that doorway across from the door that leads to the loading yard that we passed by earlier. And at the top of a gantry on the southeastern corner of this room, we find more Chinese ghouls. Heading down, we can walk amongst the pipes to loot the ghoul we just killed, and then up the stairs to loot the final Chinese officer. This leads us to an elevated platform with a bunch of supplies. We'll find some Radaway, 5.56mm rounds, and 3 ammo boxes on one shelf, and then a door to Mama Dolce's food distribution. Sure enough, going through to the other side, we find ourselves in that one room with the terminal that controlled the turret, where we first encountered the ghouls. This, then, is the way out. So before we go out, let's finish exploring this place. Retracing our steps, we can turn right to go up a stairway to the floating pod above. Here we can loot the ghoul we killed with our Gauss rifle, and this leads to a floating pod with another pre-war book, and yet another doorway to Mama Dolce's loading yard. Well, great, I think we found all of the doorways to the loading yard. Heading back down to the ground floor, we can open the double doors to the north. Here we find another stealth boy, an Edotronic with a bunch of food inside, but sadly no sugar bombs. And on the ground, an ash pile. But this is a room that I haven't been to yet. How did this black ash pile get here? Well, I think what happened is that ghoul I killed above earlier must have fallen through the ground and landed right here. So I'm looting the ash pile of a ghoul that glitched through the ground earlier. On the western side, we find 2 ammunition boxes, a desk in the corner with a 10-ball and a 13-ball, and then a surprisingly already opened safe with nothing really interesting inside, just a couple packages of darts on top. The door here leads out to Arlington National Cemetery. Here we find ourselves at that first door by the yellow metal steps that we saw just as we arrived. But we still need to explore the loading yard, so heading back inside, we can now go back and choose some of the other doors to the loading yard. So going up the big metal staircase to the floating pod to the southeast, we can open the western door to the loading yard. We find ourselves in the sniper pod overlooking the loading yard where we killed that sniper earlier. Looks like we've cleared all threats. Turning on our light, we can locate the ghoul's corpse. And here we find a box of .308 caliber rounds, and below it, another Chinese Army Special Ops training manual and an ammunition box. To continue forward, we can leave by opening a second door to the east. This leads us to the big floating pod we found earlier, Following it out, we find the body of the captain who was holding the encryption key we used for the terminal. So now we've done a big loop. All that remains is to find a way to the ground floor of the loading yard. To do so, we retrace our steps all the way to that big first factory floor room where we can unlock one of the big garage doors to the loading yard. On the other side, we see that the sun is getting ready to rise. We can climb up a ramp on top of one of the train cars and use it to jump into a big container, very reminiscent of the pit steel yard, but there's really nothing in here. To the west, we see a gate, which appears to be leading to another section, but the gate is locked and it requires a key. On the other side, we see a ruined bus and the wall of another building. We see a sign on the side, IES, and an arrow pointing to the right, possibly the word deliveries. But where's the key? Well, there is no key. Bethesda never intended us to open this gate. If we toggle clipping to walk behind, we even see that they never bothered to finish spelling the word deliveries since no one was supposed to see it. So we'll just head back. There's not much here in the loading yard, although we do find a big pile of irradiated toxic barrels piled to the east. Perhaps this is the cause of the radiation warning we found on one of the terminals, and perhaps it is what caused all of these Chinese communists to turn into ghouls. But we never really get any indication as to where this toxic waste came from. I mean, this was a food processing plant. Does producing sugar bombs really produce this much toxic waste? Seems a little strange to me. When done, we can exit any way we want. Let's go through the northern door. This leads us to that one door that we bypassed earlier, next to the one room with the flooded floor, covered with the metal grating that we saw earlier. And that is the full story of Mama Dolce's in Fallout 3, a front for the communist Chinese, engaged in covert operations on American soil. What are your thoughts on this? Were you surprised to learn that the Chinese had infiltrated American soil? Let alone that so many of them had survived for 200 years as ghouls. You know, if the Chinese sent spies to American soil, whom we find 200 years later, it's just as likely that America sent American spies to China, which would mean that 200 years later, in 2277, there may be American soldiers or the descendants of American soldiers living in China, perhaps speaking Chinese or perhaps unaware, like these poor souls, that the war had even ended. Do you agree with me? Do you think that the Chinese communists likely killed the factory workers who were working here to take over the building for their nefarious purposes? How do you explain that propaganda message we heard while approaching Mama Dolce's? I can't really imagine any Americans falling for that, listening to that broadcast and going, "Oh, great point. America must suck. I'll be a communist now." If anything, I would think that that broadcast would give away the location of these Chinese spies. But apparently it didn't. And what about the broadcast tower KT8? How can you explain the 2 dead ghouls in the locked basement? Why was the broadcast turned off when we arrived? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. I publish a new Fallout video 6 days a week on a wide range of topics spanning all of the games. So if you want to make sure that you don't miss my next video, be sure to subscribe and to click that bell notification button. Feel free to follow me on Facebook and Twitter for all Oxhorn-related announcements, including changes of schedule and vacation time and all of that. And if you like what I do and you want to support me in a more personal way, consider becoming one of my patrons on Patreon. But more than anything, I'm just so glad you're here watching this video with me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow morning, bright and early, with a brand new video.